And I don't want it to sound like I'm saying that there's nothing that needs to change at the NRC. Nothing could be further from the truth. What I'm saying is if we're looking for the root cause of what is going on in the US nuclear industry, particularly on the new build side, I think we have way overstated the case for it's the nuclear regulation stupid, and we're going to pass law after law after law and not actually deal with some of the fundamental issues that we have in this industry.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined once again by James Krallenstein, a guest at this point who needs no introduction, but to me really typifies an ideal Decouple guest. I'm going to fluff your feathers here, James, as I'm prone to do, but the right mixture of technical expertise, encyclopedic knowledge, and a very rare characteristic, which is what seems to be like pretty total freedom of speech. So we don't do heterodoxy for heterodoxy's sake here on Decouple, but it certainly is refreshing to be able to have these kind of conversations. A lot of people who reach out to me and would like to be able to share opinions, but just are not able to. So hopefully we can keep you that way, James. I noticed the Decouple T-shirt. It's nice to see. Welcome back.
Thanks. So I guess we're talking about nuclear regulation.
We are. I think I don't know if you've been formally branded as an NRC apologist, but you reached out to me a little while ago wanting to talk regulation and NRC. And just last week, I believe, Ted Nordhaus came out with a piece. It's the regulation stupid. And, there's this question that dogs us nuclear advocates, which is that particularly Western nuclear is just not affordable, not cost effective, certainly in the construction phase. And everyone wants to find out the reasons why. And I think a really convenient reason that's been identified and is kind of a widespread perspective is that this is just an area it's the regulation that's kind of taxing it to death. So really excited to engage with that. We have the example of the big cost plume of overnight construction costs in the US after 3 Mile Island, which a lot of people attribute to overregulation. We have NuScale having to pour $500 million into a design certification process, Oklo being turned down. There's lots of reasons why people are angry at the NRC and angry at overregulation or the perception of overregulation in general. And I really hope to break that down with you.
So I think this is a great topic. And, I think sort of, the piece, although Nordhaus, I think where Ted was trying to make it seem like there's some apparent hordes of progressive nuclear advocates who are fighting against, the sort of dogmatic position that he sort of exemplified by his position, paraphrasing James Carville for the 1992 Clinton George H.W. Bush election. It's the economy stupid. It's the nuclear regulation stupid. And, I was actually talking about this this morning with a nuclear engineering colleague of mine. And all of us were sort of at this sort of, after reading it, we're sort of like, does Ted secretly live in 1983? Because I think the real question that we have is not, was nuclear regulation, particularly the nuclear regulatory system that we had in the 80s post 3 Mile Island, was it a huge driver during the post 3 Mile Island and even to some extent during the 70s pre-TMI in spring of 79? Absolutely was a very, very large driver. And arguably, there's still obviously major improvements that can be done here. But the question that we need to ask is, there's been a huge seismic shift in the way that the United States regulates nuclear power plants. And we're talking about the US here. This was really focused on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And bizarrely, none of those shifts were sort of dealt with in the piece. And I wonder how many people actually appreciate how different the sort of regulatory approach that a nuclear power plant can take to get regulated by the NRC today versus what it was like in the 70s and 80s. And even some of the shifts that were already happening in the 70s and 80s, we don't seem to talk about. So, but before we go into that, and before also, I think it's useful to sort of separate this from the nuclear regulation component of this from the sort of National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, and other sort of non-nuclear regulation that has to get done. I want to ask three basic framing questions that should be really easy to answer if it in fact is the nuclear regulation stupid, right? And the first question is, imagine a situation in which we're trying to build a newly designed reactor by the United States. And we have in one country, we have a system that is really, really good, regular through whatever means. It's churning out light water reactors, gigawatt scale light water reactors, in median 5.5 years. And it's literally done dozens of this just over 2 decades. Okay. And then we build another reactor in the United States, the exact same design. And we're going to argue, oh, it's the nuclear regulator, right? That's the main cause of construction and schedule overruns that we've seen plaguing the nuclear industry. And obviously we have a country where the nuclear regulator, whatever they are, is able to construct plants in a way, or allows construction in a way that they're happening in 5.5 years, literally, and 50% being faster than 5.5 years, by the way. Right? And then we build it in the United States. Almost surely, if the nuclear regulator is the cause of this in the United States, the US sort of build is going to be much, much slower, much, much more problematic, right? Because it's not the industry that's fundamentally the problem. It's ultimately the regulator stupid, right? Great. So let's run this experiment. Oh, wait, we actually did do this experiment. And we built 2 AP1000s in Georgia, Vogtle Units 3 and Units 4. And we built 4 AP1000s in China, which was Sanmen Unit number 1 and number 2, and Haiyang Units number 1 and Units number 2. And lo and behold, they take nearly the exact same time. Sanmen Unit number 1 takes 9 years, 4 months. And then Vogtle 3, which gets caught up in the COVID epidemic, right? And as we've discussed earlier, remote work for nuclear power plant construction doesn't really work. Zoom calls for, placing rebar doesn't work. But that was only about 10 years, 3 months for nuclear construction in Vogtle. So literally, they're about the same construction duration. So obviously the nuclear regulator in either one is not the rate limiting factor here. But wait, you say, oh, of course, that was a Western design. It was designed to the NRC's unrealistic safety requirements. And therefore, the design became unbuildable, right? And so that's why even the Chinese couldn't build it, right? Because they were too, catering to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for that design certification. Great point. Now imagine that we had, let's say, the first nuclear reactor design that ever went through the modern NRC process, right? Like the first one that went through the Part 52 design certification process and got it, by the way. The NRC granted that design certification. Let's build that reactor and let's compare it to the Generation 2 reactors that came before it, that we built in the United States and around the world, right? If in fact the NRC is requiring this to be, these new safety requirements to be so onerous that no one can build this plant, surely that reactor design, which is the first one that goes through this new regulatory process, is going to be slower, more expensive, and just impossible for anyone to build. But wait, in that reactor design, this is not a hypothetical anymore. We built the General Electric Hitachi Toshiba Advanced Boiling Water Reactor, the first reactor to get a design certification from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Not only did we build the first 2 in Japan, the exact same design basis that is certified in the United States, right? We built it in less than 40 months of nuclear construction for the first of a kind unit. And that first of a kind unit was 40% cheaper than reactors that were being built at the exact same time in Japan that were the Generation 2 technology. That is the boiling water reactor 5 in the Mark II containments. 40% cheaper for the first of a kind versus the 7th BWR5 in the Mark II containment. So my question is, am I just so stupid that I don't see the empirical support for it? Let me ask you the question. Here we have an example where we have a US builder who has many, many problems, and they have that exact same problem in a world with the NRC, without the NRC. We have a design certification process that works, that we go through, that we not just give it for the ABWR, for the System 80 Plus from Combustion Engineering, for the ESBWR, for the APR 1400 that everyone holds up as this ideal, that the South Koreans built at Baraka and at Shinkori, right, which is generally held as a very buildable reactor, although we could have some arguments about that. That also has an NRC design certification. The AP 1000, the NuScale Voyager, the US 600, the ESBWR. All of these reactors have design certifications. And we've, in some cases, built them faster and cheaper than the previous second generation legacy nuclear power plants. And we know from just a sheer design basis that these are dramatically simpler. So my question back to you is, if this is such an obvious question, explain to me the very basic empirical reality that has happened in nuclear construction after the last 30 years.
That's a pretty compelling counter argument. I think we could just finish the episode right now, James. No, but that's a fascinating story, and I think a lot of people are aware of that ABWR build. Well, I should say a lot of people within the nuclear advocacy community, and it's certainly celebrated. But I think you brought some interesting context there, and just what a kind of compare contrast. Again, a first of a kind coming in so affordably, so quickly. Making that comparison with the AP1000 experience in the U.S. and China. And I know the ABWR is being considered in the U.S. to be built, I think, in the South Texas project. You were filling me in.
It was licensed. Full combined operating license was issued for Units 3 and Units 4.
And there was a finished reference plant available. I mean, why didn't they just build ABWRs? I know this isn't the focus of today's discussion, but I just can't help it.
That's a whole other discussion, but I think we'll touch back on this. But it's not just that. I think what's weird about this is, let's go back historically. So we've talked a little bit about good nuclear design, nuclear construction, which is rare but happened, and bad nuclear construction, which is unfortunately in the United States was, especially in the 70s and 80s, was the dominant case in the majority of time. But let's talk about one of the successful ones, Palo Verde, right? And the reason why I bring up Palo Verde's units 1 through 3 is because that represented not only a very advanced Generation 2 reactor design, but the first standardized, arguably, reactor licensing process that we had in the United States. There's a common myth that is repeated ad nauseum that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has never, before the AP1000s were built and finished at Vogtle, had never actually issued like a license or design certification to a design that was actually built. That's not true. Right, the Combustion Engineering System 80 design that was first built at Palo Verde and was also being built at Washington Nuclear Project 3 and 5, as well as at Yellowknife by Tennessee Valley Authority, actually arguably was the first time that the NRC fully standardized, at least under what was called 10 Part 50 Appendix O, right? The equivalent of a final design approval. That was actually done fully by the NRC, right? It was a two-step licensing process, and we should go back and talk a little bit about how the NRC licensing processes have worked, but because it's really important to understand. But that was actually given what we call preliminary and final design approval, all by the NRC. The AEC did not exist for either one of these, and the construction permit for Palo Verde referenced a standardized design. It was something called the Caesar, depending on how you pronounce it, CESSAR, Combustion Engineered Standardized Safety Analysis Report. And what that provided was a reference under the 10 Part 50 Appendix O, if you know your regulations. In 2007, this was moved over to 10 Part 52 Subpart E. This is a final design approval process that allowed us to at least standardize the nuclear island and the nuclear steam supply system, such that we wouldn't have to repeat the design and engineering each time, and the regulatory process. So that was issued by the NRC, and Palo Verde went through it and had one of the most successful builds, arguably, in the U.S., not only because it didn't take actually that short, it was 10 years still, but we saw a very dramatic, over 40% price drop in overnight costs between unit number 1 and unit number 2, right? And we had a very challenging sort of environment to do this in. We had it obviously post 3 Mile Island. The plant was in the middle of the build. And it was a very challenging, no waterways, no logistics, no cooling resources. And this was a massive plant. Was then, and just until Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4 came online, was the most large nuclear power plant in the United States. And the idea that we did not see, even at the beginnings of the Appendix O processes and the Appendix N processes, which then paved the way for Part 52, that we weren't starting to see some real systematic ways that we're going to start addressing the major ways that nuclear regulation was contributing to cost overruns. It's just not true. We saw that process happen over 40 years. I think the problem is that after Sharon Harris, unit number 1, whose construction permit was issued in 1978, we did not start construction on a new nuclear power plant until Vogel and Summer happened in 2012 for nuclear construction, at least. And so the sort of regulatory changes that have occurred that arguably addressed a lot of the systematic challenges that were faced in nuclear regulation, we just really haven't had a very large sample size to be able to really elucidate how those new processes are going to work and improve potentially the ways that regulations get into got us into trouble.
So at the outset, you mentioned that the article felt like Ted's article felt like it was written in 1983. Well, let's talk a little bit about that era. Framing I've heard as well from Brett Kugelmass is that the nuclear industry stopped building new plants and just sort of became a self-licking ice cream cone, installing endless upgrades and safety systems. So there's this era right after 3 Mile Island in which I guess it's under Part 50, where the operating license is not given up front, or you don't get full approval right from the get-go as you do with Part 52. And so with some of the lessons learned at 3 Mile Island, there's just a plethora of new regulations that come along and leads to the cost plume.
Let's, before we go into how Part 50 versus 52 works, let's pause here and just also note one other thing. Remember, the Nuclear Regulatory Commissions, it's not like when there's no new reactor construction, it just goes home. Its main job historically, especially before we were building plants, was, at least in the nuclear energy industry, was regulating and maintaining the existing fleet, right? And as you know, each nuclear power plant has 2 resident inspectors who are employees of the NRC, who are actually literally stationed at the power plant, who are constantly inspecting, and each plant gets hundreds, if not a lot more, of hours of inspection each year, and has to continuously maintain safety standards coincident with what the NRC regulations require. And remember, yes, it's true that we stopped building plants during this time, but whatever happened between the industry and the NRC did not get in the way of the U.S. nuclear fleet becoming the highest capacity factor large fleet in the U.S. And we did not see, with some notable exceptions, and we'll talk about them, that many shutdowns of plants being ordered rather than retrofits being required. And I think that there are some really good examples of industry-led, government-enabled regulation, particularly post-Fukushima Daiichi, right, where we saw that the U.S. nuclear industry really put together a pretty comprehensive response called FLEX to what happened at Fukushima Daiichi, and the NRC sort of went along with that framework and allowed the retrofitting to happen in a way that did not overly interrupt the operations of existing power plants, and I think materially dealt with the safety concerns that accident happened. So I just want to remember, the NRC is also running and maintaining the licenses for operating plants, and also doing obviously all of the license renewals for 20 years after that 40-year requirement, and then the supplemental, the SLRs, the supplemental license renewals as we push from 60 to 80 years of license activities. Now, these are all places where there's a lot of improvement. And I don't want it to sound like I'm saying that there's nothing that needs to change at the NRC. Nothing could be further from the truth. What I'm saying is, if we're looking for the root cause of what is going on in the U.S. nuclear industry, particularly on the new build side, I think we have way overstated the case for it's the nuclear regulation stupid, and we're going to pass law after law after law and not actually deal with some of the fundamental issues that we have in this industry. So let's go back to what you brought up earlier on this Part 50 versus Part 52 challenge. So historically, after the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 passed, and we started first getting the first civilian nuclear power plants, As you mentioned, we utilized a two-step licensing process called 10 Part 50. And what that licensing process means is that what you do is you go to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and initially you file what's called a preliminary safety analysis report, among many other things, that sort of analyzes preliminarily what the safety consequences of this nuclear power plant that you're going to build and how it's going to comply with the NRC regulations. And then the NRC not only convenes its own hearing, convenes public hearings chaired by the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board in the communities that the plant is going to be built in. Also, there's a second committee that is convened called the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards that is sort of separate to the NRC, that's sort of independently, or the AEC at this time, independently reviewing that construction permit application. And if all of them sort of go through all of those processes, they issue a construction permit. Now, there's a lot of opportunity here, by the way, for interveners, like anti-nuclear activists, to come in and either sue the AEC or NRC on these processes before they can issue the construction permit application, as well as actually intervene in some of these proceedings themselves, like the ASLB. And then that construction permit authorizes the plant licensee, as well as its contracting partners and its reactor vendor partners, to actually construct the nuclear island, including safety critical components of the nuclear power plant. And as we're sort of building that plant, generally, and there's an old probabilistic method that you would use to actually know when you would sort of apply. You sort of apply for a second step. The construction permit, and this is a very top level sort of, I'm not going into all the details, only because it's very hard and a lot of people, I don't know why, surprisingly find it boring. But I'm just trying to make it a tad entertaining for your audience. So the construction permit process is only a permit to construct. It is not a license. It does not allow the reactor licensee, which is not a licensee at this point, to actually load fuel or bring the reactor critical or commence power operations. It is rather just a permission to build the nuclear island, including all the components necessary. But in order for you to get that permission to actually load fuel, to let the reactor go critical, and so on, you have to, as you noted, apply for a second sort of process called an operating license. And this involves you, rather than having your preliminary safety analysis report, you combining everything that you've learned from the construction of the plant, your final safety analysis report, which reflects how the plant actually was constructed. And then the NRC again, and the ACRS again, and the ASLB again have to go through a whole nother process to grant you an operating license for the reactor to turn on, for you to have permission to operate the reactor. Now, there's three major challenges that this immediately poses. The first is you may not get the operating license. And that has happened. For example, I was just, as you know, on Long Island enjoying a very nice beach vacation. And out on Long Island, there is Shoreham Nuclear Power Plant, which got a construction permit, finished all of their nuclear construction. By the utility at the time, Long Island Lighting Company, filed a final safety analysis report, went through all of the processes, actually got the NRC to agree with everything. But part of the issue was, historically, in order to get an operating license, you needed to have the local communities agree that you could actually evacuate with the evacuation plans. And because the state of New York and Suffolk County, the county that it's in, never agreed to the licensing plans, mainly because of steadfast anti-nuclear opposition, the NRC at that point was unable to basically issue an operating license to that plant. And although the NRC tried to force that along with the LILCO by giving them permission to do low power physics testing, i.e. bringing the reactor to about 5% power so that you would have to decommission the plant because you actually made it radioactive, they never actually were able to get the operating license issued because there were such steadfast interveners from not only the anti-nuclear community, but also from the state of New York that was trying to really hard prevent the issuance of this OL. So that plant never got permission to operate, and $6.5 billion, now more than $14 billion in inflation-adjusted terms, that every ratepayer in Long Island, much of my childhood, paying that bill for a power plant that was just never issued that operating license to turn on. So that's a big problem, I would say. And this happened not only at Shoreham, of course, but in Seabrook, in New Hampshire, where we had communities in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire say that they couldn't evacuate, and they finally had the NRC basically override the communities and basically just force an operating license to be issued because they didn't want to have basically a repeat of what occurred at Shoreham. So that's the first thing that can happen. But those are kind of edge cases and really bad. We don't want that to happen, obviously. That's a really bad situation that doesn't really make sense. If you're going to build the plant and you build the plant up to regulations and demonstrate that you can build it up to regulations, you should be allowed to operate. The second challenge that we had in this two-step process is the reactor design is not necessarily done when you're starting that construction. Now, on one hand, that gives you a lot of flexibility when you're building the plant, right? It allows you to, if you have some challenges that you've identified as you're constructing the plant, to not necessarily be locked in to a single design. But on the other hand, if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission begins, or the Atomic Energy Commission, and this proceeds way before the NRC was created in February of 1975, if you have the NRC changing the safety regulations, there is no guarantee that the NRC is going to utilize the regulatory basis and standards and regulatory codes that were in place when the construction permit was issued. So what you get happening is, as the NRC changes their regulatory basis, right? Let's ask this basic question. You're in the middle of construction. You maybe even finished the construction of this plant. What happens all of a sudden if a new regulation comes in and that already built system is not compliant, no longer compliant with this new regulation issued by the NRC? Well, you don't have an operating license. So there's a very good chance when you go ahead and submit your FSAR to the NRC is going to say this system is not compliant with the regulations. And say, well, it's compliant with the regulations when I file the construction permit. They're going to say, great, but you're filing for an operating license now, and it's no longer compliant with code. And so you have to rebuild this. And this backfitting phenomenon was a really, really large driver of cost overruns, a massive cost driver. And as Ted correctly points out, especially after 3 Mile Island, where so much of the regulatory code started to change, this really became a systematic problem in a really, really serious way, where we had, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, of rework being required. And then the third thing, or backfitting, to basically meet regulations that did not exist when the construction plans were initially drawn. And then the third thing that you had initially as a very big problem is you have this general perspective of these regulations that are basically in 10 part 50, 51 for the environmental codes. You have obviously other sections of Title 10 that you're sort of dealing with. But that doesn't really tell you how you're going to build a power plant, right? And because there wasn't necessarily a fully licensed design, there's a lot of guesswork, especially initially when the amount of regulatory guidance was initially done, to actually see if the design that you were going to build was compliant with what the NRC would interpret the regulations as. So you had this sort of 3 major issues. The first is that there could be intervener and other intervention in the operating license process that prevents you, even if you built the plant, demonstrated compliance, from getting an operating license. So you're screwed. The plant can't make any power if it can't turn on and can't do commercial operations. The second thing is that you have no surety under Part 50 that the NRC is not going to change the regulations mid-construction, and that you're not going to literally have to go back and destroy systems that had already been built to comply with regulations that literally did not exist when construction started. And then the final third thing is it's not necessarily clear, because there was not really a design approval or certification process for much of this time, that the designs that you are doing actually are compliant. The NRC may have a different, or the AEC may have a different interpretation of the regulatory codes than you do, and you don't necessarily find that out until you're submitting your FSAR for the operating license.
Right, right. So as you were saying, in the 1980s, perhaps it was the regulation stupid. So what changes in your view?
So even before we start reorganizing completely this two-step process, we begin starting in 1972 at the Atomic Energy Commission. They recognize that this process of going plant by plant by plant, and having each power plant sort of submit a custom safety analysis report and a custom regulatory process is not a great idea. At the end of the day, if you're standardizing some aspects of the plant systems, we should have a way from a regulatory process to have that reflected and not repeat the same system over and over again, and have it evaluated and maybe come up, by the way, with different results depending on which reviewer and regulator was reviewing that application at the time. So we begin seeing opening up processes for standardization that happen. There's three major avenues that happen before we totally rewrite the code. One is called Appendix N, where we allow us to basically apply multiple different reactor construction permits and operating licenses can be submitted together at multiple sites, because they're going to basically use a single design basis. It's identical from plant to plant to plant. And this happened, of course, at Wolf Creek and Callaway, using SNUPs, or Standardized Nuclear Unit Power Plant Systems, which is a Westinghouse 4-loop nuclear steam supply system, a General Electric turbine, and using Bechtel as the ultimate architect and engineer and constructor. And that was done through a unified common licensing process where all the plants, there were initially 6, we only ended up building 2, that actually started on this construction permit operating license process. That's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is the NRC recognizes that at some point the nuclear island vendors are going to want to license and standardize the design. So they introduced 10 Part 50 Appendix O, which allows us to do design approvals, which basically says if you're combustion engineering, you can basically make a standardized safety analysis report that can be you can reference in your construction permit application, your PSAR. That's what we call a preliminary design approval, or PDA. And then you also can do a final design approval and make a standardized safety analysis report for your FSAR for that design. And not only are we going to do it for the nuclear island, we're also going to allow the balance of plant vendors to be able to actually do this. So the architects and engineer, Abasco, Stone and Webster, they all began actually standardizing their balance of plants and the interfaces it had with a standardized nuclear island to be able to actually use the same process over and over again, such that when you applied your PSAR and your FSAR, it would just reference the standardized design approvals or preliminary design approvals for that under Appendix O, which you can see in the Palo Verde PSAR and FSAR, for example. It's referencing a combustion engineering standardized safety analysis report. So that's the first thing that happened. But that didn't really solve the ratcheting problem. It is still possible, if you still have this two-step licensing process, you can absolutely still in the middle of the reactor design, in the middle of reactor construction, change the plan. Change the regulations that can require backfitting that has already happened. Okay. So what they began doing is realizing we need to actually fix this completely and introduce a one-step process. What does that mean? It means that before you start nuclear construction, you get an operating license as well. And as part of that operating license, or a COL, Combined Construction and Operating License, you have a set of tests that are part of your license. They're actually called ITACs, Inspection, Test, Analyses, and Acceptance Criteria, that literally say this is how you are going to demonstrate that you built the power plant in conformance with what your license had. And if you have demonstrated and closed out that ITAC process, we will literally say there's no more hearing that has to happen. There's no mandatory hearing. There is one possibility for an intervener to be able to intervene there if only they have on its face or prima facie obvious evidence that in fact ITACs have not been met and closed. But if that hasn't happened, literally the NRC just issues a quick letter, and this happens in the case of Vogtle 3 in less than a week from when they notify that the ITACs were closed. They basically say, okay, you can go ahead and begin loading fuel, pre-critical testing, and bring the plant operational. So we basically do this. We take that entire two-step process and say, no, we're giving the operating license before you start nuclear construction. You need to demonstrate that your design is done, that you're building the plant in conformance with the design, and there we go. So we really eliminate the backfitting problems, and we also eliminate the opportunities for motivated anti-nuclear activists to stop operation of the plant once the plant is constructed. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a huge opportunity for intervention before the COL issue. There is. There's still work that needs to be done there. But once at least we started nuclear construction, right, and we can demonstrate that the plant is built in conformance with the design basis and licensing basis, we can operate the plant.
So, I think another major concern voiced in the advocacy community again is, that there's just way too much regulation. And I think again, people really refer back to that cost plume. I wish I had it here and we could put it up on the screen. But again, that you had, a pretty flat overnight construction cost throughout the 60s, and then it just goes nuts with plants that were again under construction or started construction.
Well, it really starts going way up in the 1970s, way before 3 Mile Island, right? Yeah.
But I think, through looking at this graph, a lot of people say, hey, like, why aren't we just building the reactors that were affordable to build back in the 60s before we had to add on all this extra, safety bells and whistles? Nuclear is safe enough. Look, when a meltdown happens, it doesn't even, as proven with Fukushima, it's not really resulting in any significant public health impacts. Maybe we'll just kind of step back from the detail here and just talk theoretically about, I like making aviation comparisons when I talk about nuclear safety personally, when I talk about waste and things like that. But maybe this is a point to just talk more kind of, first principles of maybe.
This is one of the things I don't really understand. And maybe I'm missing something here. I've been to a lot of Generation 2 nuclear power plants, and I know the design of Generation 3 nuclear power plants pretty well. I have never really seen that those designs were simpler or more constructible. Right? If we look at what a Generation 2 pressurized water reactor is, let's talk about like a big 1,200 megawatt one that was built like Indian Point, unit number 2, unit number 3, that was built in came online in the early 70s, right? And very affordable, right? And then I look at that as an AP1000. If you were to believe what many of the nuclear advocates say, right, at least in the US, you would expect the AP1000 is a much bigger plant. It has, double or triple containments. It has so many more pumps, so many more safety systems, and it's the exact opposite, right? If we compare that to like Indian Point unit number 2, right, we're going to find 50% fewer safety-related valves. We're going to find 35% fewer pumps, 80% less safety-related piping. And that means that we have so many less welds to inspect. As an example, we have so much less of the NQA1 process and 10 part 50 app B. That's to track every single pipe as we go through the process. We have 85% less control cable, and just the total amount of building volume that is built to withstand an earthquake, which, as we've talked about many times before, is actually one of the major drivers. That's 45% less than that Indian Point unit number 2. So my question is, great, we could go and try to build another large pressurized water reactor of Generation 2 style. In fact, we could try to build another Palo Verde style reactor. We had the Cesar P and F were on the books for years, right? That could allow, and in fact, many people got construction permits. Whoops got construction permits. Yellowknife got construction permits. We could build the sort of slightly improved version of that System 80 Plus that got a design certification right after the ABWR did in 1997. I don't understand how making a bigger, more complex reactor and with a lot more safety systems really is going to be cheaper or easier to build than a passively safe, dramatically simpler reactor. Once again, I mean, obviously, it's the nuclear regulation stupid, so I'm missing a really obvious thing here. But the whole point that I think people forget is that the industry's moved to passive safety in the 70s and 80s and 90s was motivated primarily by cost concerns. right? If you think about what, say, an emergency car cooling system requires in an active safety plant, it requires, at a minimum, for active safety systems for a pressurized water reactor or boiling water reactor, right? It requires a high pressure safety injection system or coolant injection or core spray system, right? That's because we have certain scenarios where we have what are called small break loss of coolant accidents. Those are accidents where a valve gets stuck open, like what happened at 3 Mile Island, which means that the reactor coolant system is still at a very, very high pressure, but we're losing reactor coolant inventory. And we have to be able to pump new inventory into the system, right, at a very, very high pressure. But on the other hand, if you have a very large break and you depressurize the reactor coolant system, all of a sudden you need to be able to put a huge amount of volume in at a much lower pressure. As a whole separate system, your low pressure systems, low pressure coolant injection, low pressure safety injection, LIPSI, or low pressure core spray or low pressure core flutter. And for each one of those, right, you need to have your own independent sets of instrumentation and control that it allows the operator to see how those systems are running, right? You need to have your own emergency diesel generators, class 1E, right, that are able to withstand an accident and can spin up and load serve the loads of those HIPC or LIPC systems in a time before you start damaging fuel. And you need to have that then redundant a couple of times because ultimately pumps sometimes break and don't work. So you have to have one or two or three, or in the case of the EPR, four different backups, or three different backups in one primary system, or just four independent safety trains, or two independent safety trains at a minimum to do this. Compare that to what we do on an AP1000, which is utilize natural convection, natural forces to be able to withstand the largest credible break loss of coolant accident without any emergency diesel generators, with systems that are reliable enough that we don't need as much redundancy as we do with these active safety systems. We don't need these independent systems for engineering safety feature actuation, although we do obviously have quadruple redundancy in the protection and monitoring system, and then also a diversity system as well. This dramatically reduces the cost that it takes to build a nuclear power plant. On the other hand, remember that the actual components that are part of a nuclear power plant are only about 20% of the overnight cost of the nuclear steam supply system. That is the reactor pressure vessel, the pumps, the pipes, and so on. As we've talked about before, so much of the cost of a nuclear power plant are driven by the building volumes, by the balance of plant systems. So being able to shrink the volume that we're being able to build by making it passively safe also saves a huge amount of money, and not having to have also, by the way, safeguard buildings for each one of those safety systems is a huge amount of savings, not just in the actual component cost, but literally allowing us to shrink down the size of the safety related nuclear island.
So, it was interesting. Ted did reference the EPR. You just mentioned it there. Is it the regulation stupid over in Europe, where
I think one of the
seem to have a different design philosophy?
things that I thought was a kind of a tell is Ted is going on about the NRC all the time, and he chooses the one light water reactor design that's being built in Western countries that does not have an NRC design certification, where arguably the NRC had the least amount of involvement in that, although there was an application for NRC design certification that was abandoned by Framatome. So one of the things that I think people sometimes get confused is there was actually a huge regulatory split between the United States and Europe. That still persists. And a lot of Western European countries simply don't credit passive safety systems in the same way that the NRC does. They have far more prescriptive regulations that really preclude the sort of the simplifying systems that you can demonstrate are not only cheaper but dramatically safer. So you don't need these redundant systems. So, for example, an AP1000 does not have a secondary containment. It just has a primary containment that you can demonstrate pretty analytically, has a very low probability of failure. So you basically are trading, rather than having this backup system, you're saying, no, I'm going to actually make it just much more reliable and simplify the system. There's a lot of European regulators who have historically not credited such an idea, which is why, of course, the EPR has two containments, right? It has a primary and secondary containment system, of which are designed completely redundantly, right, to be able to withstand a total failure of the primary containment system. But they also did not credit these passive safety systems at all. So what the EPR has, really catering at this point to German regulations, actually. Remember, the EPR was initially a Siemens Kraftwerk Union Framatome joint project. And given that it was going to be having to be built in Germany, the Germans had not done the same amount of research that the NRC had done through the 80s and 90s uh, to to understand how to analyze passive safety systems. They instead basically made 100% capacity, fully redundant safety systems. Each one has a high pressure system, a low pressure system, its own instrumentation and control system that may even have its own redundancies in actuation logic for each safety train. It has its own diesel generator for each one of those safety trains. For three of them, at least, there's one that has a common share, one set that has a common share, but there's three independent, what are called safeguard buildings, that are each independent buildings that house each one of these high pressure and low pressure safety injection systems and have their own independent water sources that are also protected. So, for example, for RCS, for reactor coolant system inventory makeup, they have their own protected RCS inventory makeup sources on each one. So here we have an example. This is what real regulatory inflexibility and prescriptive regulation looks like. If you're forcing a design that just says, no, we can't innovate at all, the only way you're going to do it is make more backups after backups after backups, you get something like the EPR, which really is a very, very difficult plant to build and has 7 to 10 times more concrete than an AP1000 does.
So, in terms of just the sheer volume of regulations that piled up, many analysts have looked at that and sort of correlated that to construction delays. I think you have a different take on that. Again, in terms of this process of arriving, I think your thesis is lots of problems in the '80s, but we're not stuck in the '80s anymore. Things have changed a lot. We've actually got better reactors now because of the regulations that piled up. This is, I haven't heard of this anywhere else, James. So, if you can
So
clarify.
so let's take another. We've been responding to Ted's piece, and overall, it's actually a pretty compelling piece. I recommend everyone read it. It's not. It's certainly a well articulated and provocative, albeit predictable position. Take another famous guy who I always hear brought up, a nuclear advocate, Jack Devaney, who gives this example of something called called the double guillotine break rule. Okay, so the double guillotine break rule was this rule that was put in the early 70s when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, actually the Atomic Energy Commission at this point, required that nuclear power plants have these emergency core cooling systems, these abilities to be able to demonstrate that they're able to withstand a design basis loss of coolant accident. And the question is, what is a design basis loss of coolant accident? And obviously, you could think about, well, maybe a pipe breaks, for example, and that you have, a pressurized water reactors at thousands of pounds per square inch. The whole system is pressurized. So if you break integrity of that system, if you have a little break, a lot of coolant's going to jet out, and you can uncover the core, damage cladding, and maybe release fission products as a result of that. So the question, though, was, well, how big of an ECCS do I have to build? What is the sort of capacity that it needs to build at? So the initial rule that they came into place was something called the double end guillotine break, saying we actually don't know the answer to this question of how pipes are going to leak before they break. So instead, we're going to create a bounding analysis, right? What does a bounding analysis mean? It means literally we're going to take the maximum break size that can occur and basically design the systems so that they can respond to that. That's and how do you, let's think about this. How would you say, what's the maximum break that occurs? So imagine we take the largest diameter pipe in the reactor coolant system and we take a guillotine and we split it open, right? We literally just slice it open, and we slice it open on both sides, right? So it's not like even some of the water could jet through. Literally, it's all broken. You literally just take out a slice of that pipe, and now it's vented to the containment atmosphere. That is a huge leak of the reactor coolant system. And not only that, as Jack correctly points out, the NRC and AEC first, but then the NRC said, well, you have to actually now not only calculate, building pumps that can be able to recover volume to this maximum size break, but also that water that's jetting out at thousands of pounds per square inch, that's going to cause dynamic effects, pursuant to general design criterion 4, right? We have to also calculate the dynamic effects of that pipe whipping around, right? That pipe is not going to just stay there as a literally wall of water at thousands of PSI flashes into steam as it comes out. And we have to say that this jet of water, what if it hits a motor control center for a safety critical load? How is that going to impact things? How is it going to impact the internals of the reactor pressure vessel, like the core, like the sort of core barrel and core internals, as you have suddenly a massive asymmetric load on the different internals? Maybe that will cause literally the fuel assemblies to move in such a way that you no longer can get your control rods into the fuel assemblies. So all of a sudden, this simplified bounding analysis becomes a very, very complex set of engineering and regulatory requirements that you have to design your plant to. And certain plants, for instance, Indian Point Unit Number 1, could not comply with these new ECCS rules. Not Units 2 and Units 3 that just recently got shut down. But in 1973, I believe, the Atomic Energy Commission ordered that Indian Point Unit Number 1, using the backfit rule, shut down because it could not comply with the new ECCS rules. And for many other power plants, this required, they even were operating, required very, very expensive backfits and retrofits to be able to comply with. But people correctly pointed out, once again, that that's not how pipes break, right? Wouldn't it be great if there's a leak before break rule? And I think we all could agree on that. And so I'm reading Why Nuclear Power is a Flop in 2022 in my bedroom, trying not to, unsuccessfully not to throw it against the wall. And literally, you have him talk as if the leak before break rule, if we're still just doing double-end guillotine breaks, as if it's 1972. Like, as if people are still wearing bell bottoms and, flower power and there are Ford Pintos driving everywhere. Except we've studied this problem, and there's literally an entire section of the standard review plan. It's in 3.6 that is literally leak before break analysis, right? And AP 1000, EPR, the EPR before it got canceled on the design certification, multiple different design licensees have leak before break rather than double-ended guillotine break based analyses. Now, why did it take from 72 to 83, actually, when this was issued? Well, it turns out it's really, really complicated to figure out how pipes are going to break and what the credible maximum break size is, right? So you couldn't just do the initial regulation, which was a couple sentences, which is literally like, basically the power plant needs to be able to withstand the largest pipe in the reactor coolant system having a double-ended guillotine break. No, now we need thousands of pages of regulatory guidance to figure out how we are going to do an analysis that the NRC will accept that allows us to do a leak before break analysis rather than going to the maximum bounding sort of condition of the double guillotine break. But here's the problem. If you have this perspective that the way that you should be viewing regulations is the number of pages that you do it, performance-based regulation is always going to be far more complex and lengthy than a prescriptive, simple regulation that's a couple sentences.
And so the AP 1000 then gets around this by not having an active emergency core cooling system, not having to worry about guillotine breaks.
Well, no, it does. It has to be. It has an emergency core cooling system. It just is all based on depressurizing the reactor coolant system, utilizing eventually convection condensation, and gravity-based cooling to basically maintain RCS inventory. What it doesn't have to do is withstand a double-ended guillotine break. It's a little complicated here, and I'm being for certain piping, it does not have to qualify for double-ended guillotine breaking. And it's been able to demonstrate using a methodology that was first sort of elucidated in NUREG 1061 of saying, well, we can actually use a leak before break analysis to demonstrate that the maximum credible break size is going to be smaller than a double-ended guillotine break is for certain systems. Now, I should be clear, while there's hundreds of existing there's dozens and dozens of pipes in even existing PWRs that have been able to use leak before breaks. We have not been able to use it on boiling water reactors because of a failure phenomenon known as intergranular stress corrosion cracking, which basically made the NRC think that actually it would be possible that you could actually break a weld completely open and have a guillotine break. But for PWRs like the AP1000, you have been able to utilize a leak before break analysis. Same thing with the EPR, by the way. The EPR uses a leak before break analysis for crediting its dynamic effects and also sizing the emergency core cooling system.
Well, I mean, I think some people, really outside of the nuclear industry, obviously, which has its own, engineering culture, which is, hyper vigilant and very safety conscious, and maybe will be accused of over engineering. Will say, we've got such emergencies facing us in terms of, climate breakdown. We should regulate nuclear plants to the same level of safety as, say, a coal plant. I think that was not Ted's words exactly, but that's we have to look at the consequences of being so overregulated that we build a fossil infrastructure rather than nuclear. So why do we need to regulate such a high degree, again, given the relatively low public health implications of even I won't say the total worst case scenarios, but things like Fukushima?
Okay, so I have two questions for you. The first is a political question, which is that human beings, I think, unfortunately, do not evaluate risks mathematically or quantitatively. We require a dramatically higher safety standard for commercial airplanes than we do for passenger vehicles. 35,000 people in the United States alone, somewhere in that range, die in car crashes each year. We have not had a car crash, a civilian passenger death in the U.S. aerospace industry for years at this point. Not a single death. And yet, right now, there are the CEO of Boeing was just a couple days ago hauled before the United States Congress and basically grilled because of issues with the 737 MAX. Admittedly, that did lead to a fatal accident, but also just in an example of something where a door plug literally exploded out of a Boeing 737 MAX, injuring and killing nobody. But it was a national news story, and a lot of people said they'll never fly a 737 MAX after this story. My question to you is that logical in any way? Is that a rational response? Here we have the car drive to the airport as, 10 to 100 times more on a per kilometer basis, or even 1,000-fold higher probability of you dying. Yet so many more people are concerned, make it a political priority to talk about the safety of Boeing and Airbus than they do about the airplanes. That's illogical. That's not fair. That's not right. And we probably would be a lot safer if we could transition a lot more of travel to commercial airplanes rather than living on automobiles. And it's the same argument. And maybe we'd have to lower the safety standards. Maybe we don't need two pilots. Like, how often ultimately do we need a pilot and co-pilot? The question I have for everyone here is that the reaction, sure, Fukushima Daiichi did not end up having a meaningful public health impact at all. And we know, even if you believe in the most conservative linear no threshold hypothesis modeling, we know that the evacuation of Fukushima Daiichi killed more people than even the worst case scenario LNT modeling says would be dying from the radiation release. That doesn't mean we didn't evacuate people. And that doesn't mean that people weren't freaked out and that the entire global nuclear industry did not have a massive change of the prospects of it and public acceptance after Fukushima Daiichi. Until we figure out as an industry, and maybe there is a way to do this, I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. Until we have a way for the public to appreciate that nuclear safety does not need to be particularly high, I think maintaining a high level of safety is prudent for the industry's future. Because ultimately, Fukushima didn't probably killed far more people by leading to the shutdowns of the German and Japanese nuclear power plants and the excess coal power emissions than the we know that the actual radiation release could, even in the most conservative modeling, kill. But it still happened. And my question is, are we so confident in our apparently glorious nuclear industry PR skills to be able to communicate after we have a higher frequency of core melt events and core damage events, after we've, say, weakened safety standards to be able to do this? The second question I have is, what are we talking about? Which safety systems do we want to eliminate? Which regulatory requirements need to be eliminated? Because I have this huge amount of obsession that I see nuclear advocates engage in linear no threshold hypothesis versus a sigmoidal model versus a hermetic model for LNT. But most of the cost drivers in terms of safety systems are providing large source term releases. They're not to prevent like the small, minuscule releases. And remember, this wasn't always the case. So take the example of 3 Mile Island Unit Number 2, the accident there. We correctly say this was an accident that had almost certainly no public health impact, besides maybe psychological impact that had happened. It released less radiation than the NRC allows a nuclear power plant in a year to routinely release. Right? It released about 80 millirems. Right? The NRC reg, of course, is 100 millirems a year. Right? No nuclear power plant ever comes close to that. Right? A dirty plant would do 0.5 of 1 millirem in a single year. But the safety system, but inside the containment building of 3 Mile Island during this incident, the radiation dose reading inside the containment dome was 800 rem an hour, 8 sieverts an hour. So forget about LNT, forget about cancer risk or anything. If you went into that containment dome, in 20 minutes, you would have received a dose that you would have a 50% chance of being dead in 2 weeks. Now, no one did. No one died because we had a massively over engineered containment building. But that wasn't always the case. Take a power plant that was built like San Onofre Unit Number 1, not Songs 2 and 3, the ones that just were shut down in 2011. But Songs Unit Number 1 had so little shielding initially around its vapor shield, right? What was before we had containments, that in 1976, Southern California Edison had to build the sphere enclosure building, right, to be able to comply with new AEC regulations to prevent literally just if there was an accident, even without containment failure, right, just the shine, the gamma shine would be so significant in a serious accident to actually harm people in the vicinity, maybe plant workers only because it was shine, not actually necessarily fission product release. But we forget that a huge amount of the safety that we do have in the US nuclear world comes from actual regulatory requirements, or even the high pressure safety injection system that ultimately was able to terminate the loss of coolant accident at 3 Mile Island. That was an emergency core cooling system that was mandated in 72, 73 that plants necessarily before that regulation did not need to have. So I think we have the classic regulator's dilemma, which is that you make an industry really safe by regulations. We have obviously some work that we need to do in streamlining some of these effects. But what are the safety systems I asked you that you want to eliminate that will drive the cost down so much?
I can't say I have a great answer for you there, James. What do you think's motivating? Like we've said, we're searching for what the root causes of the cost spiraling, and obviously trying to control that. If we misidentify what those root causes are, we're going to spend a lot of efforts focused on the wrong thing. So, what do you think's leading to this focus on regulation right now? I mean, again, I started the intro by talking about, this is something I hear commonly is it's just so onerous to get a license. In terms of the experience of NuScale, $500 million, or yeah.
Personally, I think that it is too onerous to get a combined operating license, for example, or design certification. I think I was at the NRC in January, working with actual people who are interested in building nuclear reactors, not just advocating about it and trying to work through simplifications and new strategies to deal with it. That's absolutely true. My question is a more simple one. Not that this doesn't need attention, not that there isn't actually dramatic safety, changes that need to happen at the NRC. Um, the better question is this really the rate limiting factor? Because as onerous as it is to get a COL in the United States, right? This Part 52 combined life, we ultimately issued 17 gigawatts of new COL fully licensed capacity. No one wanted, we only built 2 to 2.4 gigawatts of that 17 gigawatts so far. There's a huge number of actively fully licensed, shovel ready from a regulatory perspective, with full environmental impact statements, the discharge permits, that literally can build their entire nuclear power plant, show that they built it in conformance with the design, and turn on. And they're not building it. So what exactly is preventing us from doing that? I think there's a lot of factors. I don't think right now regulations are the ones that are doing it. And once again, we have this example of China, where China has built dozens and dozens of gigawatts of new nuclear in the last just 2 decades, and is building it in 5.5 years. And when we try to build our power plants there, the problems that we've talked about previously on the AP1000, for example, dominate, even with their regulatory system that has a proven track record of turning around plants in 5.5 years. So I think it's a really convenient story that the regulatory system has once again failed U.S. nuclear industry. But that ignores the dramatic progress that we've made in nuclear regulation over the last 40 years.
This is maybe a little bit off topic, but I think there's an interesting controlled experiment as well that we didn't touch on, which is that the EPRs and the AP1000s took a pretty similar amount of time to get online in China. And you mentioned sort of the two different regulatory philosophies, underlying them. So, if the AP1000 is so much simpler, has fewer, active systems, like why did it take a similar amount of
Great
time?
question. So the EPR is primarily a stick-built power plant, right? By that we mean it's not a modularized nuclear power plant. As I think we've talked a lot on this podcast, the AP1000 utilized 342 modules, of which some of these modules have 72 submodules in them. As an example, the design issues that we had at the AP1000 level, right, really stopped the entire critical path of the project. Right, if the modules weren't available on site, it was for many of them difficult, if not impossible, to fabricate them on site, or if it did, it would take a huge amount of time to build the capacity to build those modules. The EPR is a traditional stick-built nuclear power plant, very little modularization. So even though the design completeness was a lot lower, you could build it like a regular nuclear power plant is. And if you could literally improvise a huge amount of that civil engineering, for example, and you weren't dependent on a module supply chain being able to spit out modules and ship you a module to the plant. But what we have, and as we've talked about before, unfortunately, the audience has really probably suffered a lot through the last 4 episodes of the ad nauseum of my voice. When we didn't have a complete design, even the Chinese project, doesn't matter how great your constructors are, doesn't matter how great your welders are, how good you are at pouring cement. If literally the module isn't there, you can't proceed. So the better question to ask is, what are we seeing now in these 7 AP1000s that are being built right now? We've done this work with some colleagues. And what we are finding right now is just for the big 6 module placements on the nuclear island in China, we are going 75% faster in nuclear island construction than we were on the first generation of AP1000s that we were building in China, which really gives you the massive sort of speed advantages that you can get from a much smaller, much more complex, much less complex and modularized power plant. But once again, if the design isn't done, if the modules aren't there, and if the supply chain isn't running, you can have the most brilliant design on paper. It can be as simple as peach pie, but it doesn't matter. You might as well choose the more complex design, because what ultimately matters here, just like nuclear regulation often isn't the rate limiting factor, it can be. It's not going to be that the nuclear islands, that you have 45% less seismic building volume. It's going to be that the modules aren't there and you're waiting a year for them to finish, get fabricated, and produced. But now that we have the design complete, and we have a design certification process, by the way, and a regulatory process that allows us to replicate for the first time. That's something we didn't talk about, the standardization of it. We have a real strong argument that this is the right way for us to.
And that was the other side of Ted's argument, is that it's the regulation stupid, whereas these, I forget what he was referring to, sort of progressive nuclear advocates say it's failure to standardize. Ted was saying basically things were fairly standard. It was two big companies delivering PWRs and BWRs. He also says that standardization may have great hope with this kind of coming next generation of reactors. So that didn't make a ton of sense to me. But
well, I think that does make a lot of sense, because he's basically arguing, well, if you're mass manufacturing the reactors,
it makes sense.
A lot of sense, right?
Listen, I'm a big fan of standardization across the board, but it was just it was sort of like it didn't matter in the previous build, but it will matter in the future. It was just a strange sort of value.
So let's go back and ask this very basic question, right? What percentage, like when we talk about a Westinghouse PWR or a GE boiling water reactor? So first of all, within that class of things, there is huge variety, right? So GE boiling water reactors, I mean, there have been 6 different models, each different of which each one can vary in power by a factor of 3. Often you have some BWR4s that are at 1200 megawatts. You have others that are at 500 megawatts, but they're also built in 3 different massively different containment systems, right? Which that vary in volume. A Mark 1 containment is 5 times smaller than a Mark 3 containment is. And when you're talking about building something, that is really different, dramatically different, totally different designs, totally different safety system designs, totally different civil engineering. But let's go back to this basic argument. What we're really talking about here is we're talking about who's provided the nuclear steam supply system. The nuclear steam supply system equipment represents about 20% of the cost of a nuclear power plant. And saying that, we basically were doing the same things, like a nuclear engineering colleague, after reading Ted's article, was like, what the fuck is this? Like, basically said, that's like saying that a Boeing 747, which has General Electric engines, turbofan engines, is sort of the same thing, ultimately, as a Boeing 787 that has General Electric turbofan engines. Yeah, the engines represent about 20% of the cost of the the plane. The engines represent 20% of the nuclear steam supply system. Components represent about 20% of the cost. What actually matters is the massive building, the massive airplane that we have to build to house that in. And there's such huge design variation between in the GE side, between a Mark 1 and a Mark 3 containment, between a BWR2 and a BWR6. On the pressurized water reactor side, an ice condenser or a subatmospheric versus a dry, large atmospheric containment, these are containment buildings. These are completely different. If it's a Westinghouse 2-loop, a Westinghouse 3-loop, a Westinghouse 4-loop, a Babcock and Wilcox 2-loop, a combustion engineering 2 or 3-loop pressurized water reactor, that we're sort of missing the forest for the trees. The vast majority of the cost that goes into a nuclear power plant is not for the nuclear steam supply system components, but for the civil engineering and excavation that needs to happen on the plant to build the buildings that the NSSS is housed in, as well as the balance of plant and the engineering services. In the case of almost all of those components, none of them were standardized and had dramatic variation from plant to plant. Because even though you might have a combustion engineering pressurized water reactor, let's say, you had totally different architects and engineers designing totally different containment buildings, totally different safety system designs, like auxiliary feed water systems, for example, right? You had totally different control room designs that were being designed for each one, even though they had the same NSSS. That's all in the remit of the A&E, of the architecture and engineers. Just like a McDonnell Douglas plane that uses GE turbofans might have a totally different cockpit design than a Boeing, airplane that uses GE turbofans, right? They have totally different cockpits. They have totally different balance of plants. They have totally different fuselages. The amount of variation in the nuclear industry is not just measured by the 56 different NSSS systems that were deployed in the fleet of only 112. It also goes down to the massively different architects and engineers that were building the vast majority of the cost of the power plant.
So going forward, do you think are you a fan of it's the lack of standardization stupid, and we're in a new era where through the regulatory environment we
So I think it's all of these things. It's not any stupid single multifactorial. This is a multifactorial problem. But I think it's sort of naive to look at the massive progress and changes that have been made in the nuclear regulatory infrastructure and just say it's still the regulations, stupid. Right? If you look at an AP1000, which was not licensable, by the way, in the 1970s and 80s as a design, there's a huge amount of research that needs to go into how we actually evaluate and credit passive safety systems in both design basis and beyond design basis accident scenarios, right? We also have the advantage of not only having those passively safe designs as well as actively safe designs that you're free to build. The advanced boiling water reactor, of course, is mainly, with the exception, and this is even arguable, of whether the reactor core isolation cooling system is passive. It doesn't require AC power necessarily, but it's certainly a turbine and it's moving water. But almost everything else is, of course, active emergency core cooling system and so on. Let's say that you can build your active safety plant if you want to, but the passive safety plants really have a huge advantage, I would argue, in terms of economics. And that's your choice if you want to go down that line in terms of simplification. But we also, kind of equally importantly, have a standardizable licensing process that allows us to replicate the exact same plant over and over and over again and have surety when you commence nuclear construction. Right. And let me explain why that matters, because it's not one of the interesting things. And I think actually you were CC'd on this. We were talking to Jacopo Bajorno at MIT about this. One of the really interesting things that we've been able to do with a new regulatory paradigm is, for example, on the AP1000, if we look at the licenses that have actually been issued at multiple sites across the country, one of the really interesting things is that the design for the nuclear island has been standardized from the base mat and above. There may be some geotechnical sort of fill, and the mud mat configuration is going to have to change a lot based on the site geology and site soil characteristics. But we have really standardized above, at least where we don't have to go beyond what the peak ground acceleration and the sort of the spectra that we have for the earthquake. We have been able to standardize entirely the nuclear island. That's the first. That's really a first that allows us to have regulatory certainty about doing that and really actually imagine us doing a more fleet-like deployment. That was never the case before in the US regulatory environment. It allows us to actually incorporate the lessons that we learned at one plant, incorporate that into the design control document or into the FSAR, and get surety that the NRC will be okay if we build that in the same way for the next plant. That did not exist under the Part 50 framework. Did not really exist even under the Appendix O framework of preliminary and final design.
All right, James, we could go on for hours. I got to pick up my little one from
Right.
aftercare. But it's been great chatting. I've learned so much in this. I think it's going to be a great contribution. There's some clamors on Twitter from Angelica and others about this very question. So glad to get a chance to get your perspectives.
Thank you for having me.
Until next time.